Testing, testing, testing. Can you hear my audio? This is Carl New Year.
Yeah, hi Carl, this is Jan. I can hear you well.
All right, very good. I'll mute myself again.
Yeah, that's fine. So you have a statement to read in the beginning, right?
Yes, that's correct. I was provided a script, just a couple paragraphs long, and then I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, that's fine.
Are you recording this?
I am assuming that the tech person starts the recording, but I could be wrong.
Okay, if you take your mouse to the bottom of the screen, maybe you see a pause or a stop recording button.
It says pause share, so that probably means that it is enabled, the recording is ongoing, right?
Yes,
yeah.
I believe so. So at the end of the meeting, somebody will just have to make sure to stop that, and then that will get downloaded to the Dropbox and distributed to the working group leads and available for the public.
Yeah. So have you started the session?
I have not started this session, no.
Okay.
But I think it's set up to record by default.
Yeah, but I mean,
so I believe it is recording.
I mean, starting the actual Zoom session, it must be that we have a role that's called the tech person that is meant to do that, to start the session and perhaps also start the recording.
Yes, that's correct. So today I'm the chat monitor.
Yeah.
There should be somebody else as the Zoom technician.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Jan Larsen. I'm co-chairing this session together with Peter Schlosser today. I would like to give Peter just 1 minute to arrive before we start, and there he is. So,
hey.
Yeah, you've been running?
Not running, I just got 5 minutes outside.
Okay. I just wonder about the mountainous picture you have there in the background, if that's your...
Oh, that's where we should be now.
Yeah.
That's a picture of the actual place where this should have taken place.
Okay, fantastic.
All right.
Okay, this is session 3, the second session today, and as before, we have a technician with us who will help us with the techniques. We also have a chat monitor, Carl New Year, and Carl, you have a statement to read for us.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening, and welcome. Some logistics before we start the presentation. You've probably all heard this before, but I'll go through it once more again. You joined with your camera off and your audio muted. If you unmute yourself at any time, please remember to remute after speaking. You can mute by pressing #6 if you're calling in on the phone, or you can hit the mute button in the lower left-hand corner of your Zoom screen. Why do we ask this? We can all hear your typing, conversations, and other background noises when you are not muted, and the hold button may cause disruptions in the presentation. If you have the option, please use headphones or a headset. If you're on the phone, please turn your computer speakers all the way down. Otherwise, we can get an echo when the phone picks up your computer audio. You can see your controls by hovering your mouse at the bottom of the screen. And from there, you can chat and see other participants via these controls. If you have a question, you may type it into the chat window, and they will be read out loud by myself or the moderator. If you need help, you can message the moderator via the chat tool or raise the hand tool, which is accessed by opening the participants window. If you want to join the discussion, you can unmute yourself and speak up, or raise your virtual hand and we'll call on you. Or you can send a chat message to the group everyone, and the moderator will read the question out loud. For folks without microphones or other audio, you can type your questions or comments into the chat, and I will read the questions out loud. This presentation will be recorded, and a video file, audio file, slides, and relevant links will all be available on the iAsk YouTube channel and AOS website. So with that, I'll turn this back over to either Peter or Jan-René.
Yeah, let me start, and as before, if you could please write in the chat box your name and affiliation, then afterwards we'll have a recording of who attended. It will be Peter that will also chair this session, but I'll just start up saying a few words. This session is about engagement strategy. We would like to look a bit into the future, and as the Roach process indicates, we will start after this session to establish relevant expert panels and an advisory board. And we know that in establishing these, we will need and we would want to engage with existing regional and global initiatives. And an outcome of this session is hopefully that we have a better picture of how to actually do this engagement, and perhaps also motivate some of you or someone you know who to be part of this this process. Before we go into the detailed discussion, I just want to share with you a document that is actually also found in the Google Doc that you have access to. As preparations for this working group, these working group sessions, a couple of us, including some of you who are here today, we have worked on this table in order to form a structured approach to this mobilization strategy. And what we have done is that we have made a table where in this column there are different themes: meteorology, atmosphere, climate, terrestrial, biodiversity, etc. And within each of these themes, we have identified different initiatives, and we have asked representatives from that initiative to record the essential Arctic variables, or the essential variables that these initiatives are working with. And then we've also asked them to provide some details about how they have derived at these processes. And we would like to encourage you who know of additional information to fill in, to fill this into this table, both in terms of, you could say, the initiatives, but also key persons that we should seek to engage after this. Having now, many of the working groups here at the AOS have now seen this table and worked with it, and we have gotten some input on how to reorganize some of the information here, meaning the basic information will stay, but we'll probably reorganize it a bit to make it useful. But just to encourage you at some point in time to review this table. If you have additional information, please add it also in terms of contact people, contacts to persons and initiatives that we would like to engage. And having said that, Peter, maybe you will guide us through the bullets here. I've taken the liberty to reformulate some of these in the break, because I believe that we had covered some of these topics already in the earlier session. So the focus in this session is a bit different. We are a smaller group today, but hopefully that will just make the discussion even better.
Yeah, thanks for doing that, Jan. And just to recap, in the previous session, we talked about the relationship between global observing systems and the Arctic system, the Arctic observing system, the fact that the Arctic observing system is in a way special because it cuts across individual domains. It is a holistic observing system that also has an emphasis, and especially highlighted through the present crisis we are in, on the human domain, socio-economic, socio-cultural components that have to be taken into consideration in terms of what we observe about the system as a whole. We have specifically talked about the question of why are global observing systems, even within their specific domain, let's say the ocean, the atmosphere, the biosphere, why are they not extending into the Arctic quite naturally? So we had discussed issues of logistics, of finances, of interest, of investment, of and vetting of individual nations and regions into the Arctic. We also have discussed, maybe we didn't make the case strongly enough that this should happen, but we did, of course, also on the positive side see that some of these observing systems do in fact reach into the Arctic or have plans to do so. Some of those who actually do reach into the Arctic still not at the kind of density that we consider as adequate. And so as we are going through the process of trying to extract information from our discussion for the conference statement and for the recommendation, one recommendation that I think did emerge from the previous session was to say that the global observing systems should enhance their efforts to extend the coverage into the Arctic. Now, what that means, can be spelled out in more detail depending on the individual cases. But in essence, what it would do for the Arctic observing system is that a certain fraction of the variables, the essential variables as defined for these specific systems, would also take care of some of the EAVs, the essential Arctic variables, as have been defined in the past and will be refined going forward. And the ROADS process is part of the procedure in doing so. So now looking at this engagement strategy, you see on the screen the questions. Now, one of them, of course, the first one is should the ROADS, or actually the second bullet, but the first real question that we have, should the ROADS process be exclusively driven by grassroots, or should the ROADS process actively engage with the regional or global networks around this? We should be aware that there are global perspectives from organizations like GEO, IOC, GOOS, WMO, regional, more bottom-up perspectives, such as AUs or SIOs. And we already had discussed a bit the different approaches where a lot of the global systems have figured out either a grid or certain sections, certain stations that they repeatedly probe using sensors that measure the same variable with the same quality and quality control. Whereas for the Arctic, we are often observing around a problem. And so it's a more variable system. And of course, the other difference is that it's an integrated system where, and of course that goes hand in hand, because for many of the problems, you need variables that are coming from different domains. So it could be atmosphere, ocean, sea ice combined. There could be land observations, hydrological cycle, land cover, snow, cryospheric parameters, and as we said before, importantly, there is a much closer connection. I'm sure, I'm convinced of that by having been part of both the global and the Arctic observing activities to the stakeholders. So with that backdrop, I would like to open up for discussion, and I see Sandy has her hand up, her virtual hand up.
Yeah, thanks for the recap from your earlier discussion, and apologies that I haven't had continuity with this working group. Regarding the observation about encouraging the northward expansion of the global observing networks, the perspective from I sit at the NOAA lab here in Boulder, even though I'm not a Fed, is that often these networks are supported by base funding from the operational agencies or research funds that are really reliably there every year, whether it's the Global Ocean Observing System or Global Atmosphere Watch was one that I worked with quite a bit. And so it's really less in the hands of the global initiatives themselves than it is in the operational agencies that are linked to those efforts and that need to build up the base funding and be encouraged to do that. And so I think that's an important, that's really, in a sense, the audience for it. The global networks can, certainly engage with their member agencies and reflect those things, but it's when the base funds come up at the mission-based agencies that you can see an impact. The other point, and this relates to an experience also with Global Atmosphere Watch, and is that one of the things that we can do within the region is help them to understand where there's broader interest or partnerships in what they're already doing. So like in the case of Global Atmosphere Watch looks at atmospheric composition and aerosols, and they usually think about aerosols completely in the climate context, but they don't really think about partnering as much around aerosols in the health context. Black carbon, being an example that we worked with quite a bit in the Arctic. And I think that helping the global networks to see where those expanded opportunities for underlining the importance of their observing networks for a couple of different reasons can be helpful, because like from just a climate perspective, you might hear that, aerosol forcing in the Arctic, it's relatively clean atmosphere. It's maybe not as big of a deal as mid-latitude monitoring of aerosols, but if you can kind of build out those partnerships and say, well, it's also a health issue when we have extreme stratification, or it's a health issue if there's going to be increased vessel traffic, then you might generate more motivation.
These are all good points, Sandy. And when we say we would encourage enhancement of global observing networks into the high latitudes, it is actually including those who are doing the science, who are delivering the scientific justification, those who are doing the observations, and those who are funding them. So, you know, we did not set that apart, because I think you can find reasons for not extending into the high latitudes in each of these communities. In many discussions that I was part of steering committees, when we were talking about global networks, even before we got to the funding decision, there were issues of prioritization. Some of that included prioritization of regions, and often in the context of, let's say, the heat budget or climate, people said, well, it's just the tropics and maybe the mid-latitudes too, but the Arctic is just an appendix, right? And the same with health. Although people recognized that there are health issues, quite severe ones, is that the number of people affected is very small. So that's not our highest priority. So I think that, and a lot of these statements came from scientists. I think that has changed. I think, you know, the science community does understand that the Arctic is a hotspot of change. Change in itself is more of a topic of research. It was not so much when a lot of these global observing systems were sort of conceptualized and when people started to think about them. So I think things have shifted, but you're right. And we mentioned that in our discussions, that we feel we are not really limited by knowledge of what to observe, why it's important, where to observe it, how often to observe it, but in essence, we are really constrained by resources at this point. And so the recommendation would have to be written accordingly so that it reflects the complexity of that question. But it still is a fact that much more could be done. And we used GoShip as one example. There is one line that goes to the Arctic. It's not occupied that often. But in principle, it actually can do it. So, you know, the recommendation really is to engage on whichever level is needed to enhance that, you know, reach of the global networks that make sense for the Arctic. And some of them don't, but most of them would into the high Arctic. So back to the question of how the Rhodes process should be driven, because what we have is, or the stage we are at, and Sandy can fill in because she's much more closely involved with it than I am or many of us are. But the way I understood that from its conceptualization to the present state, and also from the presentations, and especially Sandy's presentation as part of the AOS here, is that you know, that there is a certain architecture for it. There is there is a vision for how it should work. There are people who are sort of thinking about what are the EAVs. I mean, and you saw a table here that Jan René just showed that is an attempt to sort of look at some of the networks outside and inside the Arctic to see where are the intersections, where is the overlap, where's the synergy, where can we really enhance each other. But in the end, we still have to come up with a set of what will be considered the most important and essential variables for the Arctic. And this is in that first question, how could that process of deriving them and vetting them and sort of giving them, you know, the justification that is needed to make a case with funders and also draw scientists into that domain, how should that run, and how much should be bottom up, how would an expert panel look, and how much should come top down, and what would top down really mean. So I just opened that for comments, thoughts, responses to that.
Just a small clarification. What is meant by grassroots in this context?
It's bottom up. It's coming from individual researchers or small groups of researchers or self-organized collaboratives. So it's not coming from a high-level science plan or from high-level allocation of funding that then would sort of have to be put into an implementation scheme. And then let me, Molly, sorry for calling on you several times already. But
oh, sorry, I just stepped out of the office too. So if you asked me something in the last 2 minutes, I was out of the office. So
no, it was in the last session. But
okay.
So how did the Arctic Ocean Observing System come to pass? To which extent was that coming from the initiative on the ground, and to which extent was it driven by the mission of an agency? Because it is, of course, financed by a mission agency to a large extent.
Well, it's the overall IOOS program, the Integrated Ocean Observing System, was developed probably over 20 years ago, and it came from NOAA and NASA basically trying to do a better job of integrating all ocean observing. And so at that time, Ocean.US was and the Navy was involved too. So it was Navy, NASA, and NOAA were the three main agencies. And they decided they would do it at both a national and at a regional level. So some folks actually came to me in 2003 with some money to get the Alaska Ocean Observing System started as the Alaska regional component of the national IOOS program. So it was more agency driven.
So that would be an example of top down. But to which extent has the operation changed in terms of, or let me rephrase that. To which extent was the design actually driven by, what you would call bottom-up movement?
I would say the impetus for it came from top down, but the design has been bottom up. And we have these 11 regional systems, of which Alaska is one, and we are all designed differently based on our individual assets, our individual priorities, our individual needs. So it's a little bit of both. There's a little bit of very light top down, but I would say the majority is bottom up.
How was SIOS done? I think we have.
SIOS is more or less the same way that Molly described how they have done it.
Do we have another
it's
one?
Helen,
Helen, yeah.
Peter, it's Helen here. I could speak a little bit about SIOS if you want. That's a Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System, just following maybe on Molly's comments there. I think there's probably less grassroots on the Canadian example. From what I understand, they're following more really a goose overall approach and looking at the variables and the direction that's becoming, I guess that would be top down. But then when it's being implemented in Canada, they're going by regional level. So we're back to there's a Pacific, there's an Atlantic, there's a Gulf of St. Lawrence, which they're working on those three regions before they're tackling anything in the Arctic. But I think following what Molly was saying, I think you're going to start to see some of the individual variations coming through on these regional basis. So when it comes down to the region, I think you're going to see more bottom-up specifics maybe, or variations on it. But overall, I think the overall framework is coming top-down from Goose.
Eric?
Yeah, I can say a few words about the Eurogoose Arctic setup. When we formed Eurogoose 25 years ago, one of the first things we did was to establish what we call regional ocean observing systems. So we have one for the Baltic and North Sea and so on, but we also have one for the Arctic. And the Eurogoose setup is different from IOOS, for instance, because IOOS is a funded system from one country. Eurogoose is built by members from several countries. So the component that we have in the Arctic rules is built by national inputs. So you can say that the design of the system is reflecting national priorities and obligations.
Thanks. And let's see, Michael, you are a modeler, I know, but you are, well familiar with the German system. How are things actually done there? Because there is quite a bit of centralized allocation of funding for polar research.
Yeah, that's true. The reason, sorry. Yeah, I think I'm, can you hear me already?
Yeah, I can hear
Okay.
you, yeah.
Yeah, I was just a little bit confused about the buttons here. Yeah, actually my hand was raised not to say something about the German system as it is, which I think has both components. You can start with bottom-up ideas as well as there are ideas which come more from a top-down level. I wanted to say that from my point of view, for the roads system, I think we actually do need to involve both levels. We need to tackle it from both ends and need something like an iterative process, because a lot of the requirements for an observing system, how it should be designed, depends a lot on individual requirements from different societal sectors, from different Arctic actors. Compare, let's say, food security issues of local population with issues of, let's say, shipping traffic through the Arctic and so on. So each group, each user group, each actor group will have different requirements, and these need to be put together when you design something. So how an observing system would look like will depend on the questions these groups are asking. But on the other hand, and this could not be designed from the top-down level, but on the other hand, we need the top level, of course, because we need it organizationally, we need it for funding purposes. And so I think an iterative process involving both ends of the spectrum, I think, would be the most fruitful way to go.
So as you are talking about it, hybrid, what would the top-down part look like? And how would it connect with the bottom-up? And if you could even, sorry for asking all these, for putting all these additional questions on it, how would that look in the context of roads? How would it sort of map onto that? Because that's an international framework that is championed by SEON. And so now if you imagine, out of the German system, how would you map onto that with a hybrid approach?
Well, again, I mean, if I would do it for Germany, I would involve, let's say, agencies who are responsible for running long-term funded observational elements in the system. In Germany, it would be the German Weather Service, for example. So on the international level, I think there is no way doing it something like that without involving WMO, IOC, and these large global or international organizations and their framework, and therefore the discussion which happened in the last session was a very important one. And I think what you said in the beginning is very relevant, that we of course would be happy to see those extending their activities into the Arctic, but on the other hand, they will need some guidance by on one hand, people who are working in the Arctic for a long time from a scientific point of view. So extending this without a scientific background is not very meaningful. On the other hand, of course, we need a strong involvement of those people for whom it's going to be useful. And that's indigenous population, that's local population, that's actors in the Arctic, like economic actors and so forth, and local decision makers. So bringing those groups together, I think, should be useful. And perhaps if the bottom, you call them bottom or grassroots level, would start trying to sort their ideas on what are their needs, what are their requirements, grouped in certain subtopics maybe, could then help to get a discussion started with a higher level.
Thanks. So I hand over to Carl and then Sandy.
Yeah, I just wanted to read a chat from Colin Stedman. I don't know if everybody saw that, but he says, quote, "There is a Kingdom of Denmark initiative called GIOS, which is bottom-up, science-driven. There's little political initiative to spend, quote unquote, new money, but we have started with infrastructure applications. We have a GIOS white paper submitted to AOS."
Okay, thanks. Sandy?
Thanks. I wanted to share what might be an emerging example. I think a lot of the comments we've heard so far are quite valuable. That you would hope ideally to see some pretty blended efforts. Last year, the WMO, through its seat on the SAON board, initiated a process of engaging with the National Weather Services to get a point of contact or a liaison between WMO and SAON, with a view to perhaps use some of the infrastructures that Rodika was talking about yesterday, like WIGOS and OSCAR, to help stimulate some of this northward expansion of the WMO relevant networks in particular. And so this is, you know, a great potential and certainly a great potential starting point for an expert panel on weather and climate. But in order to move beyond sort of that core group of WMO folks, many of whom, as Michael just pointed out, don't necessarily have, like our national point of contact who was designated by our weather service, doesn't really have any Arctic experience. And so you know, the work will be in building out that engagement with our Alaska Weather Service office nationally, but also engaging with the right community level organizations to make sure we're taking kind of the full range of benefits into consideration.
Okay, so Carl, I have a hard time following the sequence when the chats are coming in and when the hands are going up. If you have a good sense for that, then I just leave it up to you on calling for the next person, either through chat or the virtual hand sign.
Okay, sure thing. I see Helen has her hand up, and also Vito Vitali entered a chat as well. So we'll let Helen go first, and then I can read Vito's chat.
Thanks.
So is my turn? Okay, but I express my concept here in the. So I believe then was indicated before that many times the development involve the national priority and is at the national level. So we need to be sure that the national community then are the community that can then push the national level, the engagement, the commitments are involved and be aware of the process and take part of the process in some way to define AVs and recommendation and requirements. Also because then they can be the person that on field can establish new measurements. We are very interested to enlarge the system because we know then how weak is. So this is a very important part, and we need people then at the end can take care of these new measurements and this new station, so these new duties.
So one comment, I'm wondering, Helen, if you took your hand down or how it disappeared, but while you're thinking about that, one comment on how we actually get interest into the discussion for expanding to high latitudes. A lot of the working groups, that steering committees, international steering committees, etc., of the global programs, had virtually nobody on there who had a strong Arctic background. I often was one of the few people who worked both globally, but also on both sides of the northern side and the southern side of the on the poles, around the poles. And that is a problem. That and you saw that actually, if you go back when WCRP was created, they had the World Ocean Circulation Experiment. It did not go to the Arctic. There was AXIS, the Arctic Climate System study, which was supposed to do the Arctic, but it never did the kind of sections that were needed to sort of do the extension. But if you were advocating in these steering groups for the necessity and the importance of high latitude observations, that you were absolutely outvoted. So part of what we probably also need is to make sure that people who are really interested in an Arctic observing system, but also have some interest, some activities going on the global scale, are becoming involved in the planning of the global systems. Because otherwise, you know, you always will lack that expertise that we have identified is needed to design the northward extension of these systems. And maybe just looking through the list here, maybe those of you who are involved in both high latitudes and global observations could, you know, voice your opinion if I'm off here, or if that is something that really has to be fixed. I think Helen is on now.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I have to figure out how to hit the unmute button again. So I hope we're all gone now. No, I just had wanted to reflect on, again, I was thinking about the Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System and the engagement strategy that we're talking about. And it strikes me as like there's a need for engagement at the high level, at the global initiatives that are there, like GOOSE and like WMO, because they can provide the overall sort of framework, the standards, this sort of information to be able to work then at a regional level. And coming back to the Canadian SIUS, they are, yes, looking at GOOSE, but I realized, and I wanted to make sure I was clear, that when they pick these regions that are going to form their own regional observing, they're actually building on grassroots initiatives that in some cases are already in place. So you've got like the St. Lawrence Global Observatory that has been pulling together information along the Quebec portion of the St. Lawrence River and now extending out into the Gulf, or with Oceans Network Canada on the West Coast. So it's like you've got the grassroots level that you're having to, I want to say, you're not force fitting them, but you're fitting them into something that has a more global framework. So I just think the engagement strategy has to be from both ends, and each brings their advantage. And I don't know that you need one before the other. I think sometimes just being conscious that they bring different things. That's my point.
That's a great point. And coming back to what I said before, I thought a little bit more about that. I always, you know, was grappling with the fact that forget about global for the moment. There are not that many scientists, no matter if you're talking hydrosphere, atmosphere, cryosphere, who work in a bipolar fashion, let alone those who are working on either side, the Southern Ocean or the southern high latitudes in general, or the Arctic, and global. So, but I always felt that this is a key to advance the Arctic case, that you have people who have expertise in high latitudes, but also comfortably move in the global community, so that they are accepted when they make a case for, let's say in our situation here, the extension of an observing system into high northern latitudes. And when we are sort of looking at the question that we have, the roads process, how can we actually put such a group together that could steer, and we have to keep in mind, Working Group 5, really one of the special tasks that we have is to look at that global Arctic intersection. We would have to identify the people who actually are comfortable with maneuvering different communities, or who definitely need, at least at a minimum, need the sort of need the recognition of those in the global networks that they, are seeing the entire system, and therefore that their voices are being heard. And that to me, it seems like this is a little bit of a bottleneck, but maybe that's just my personal experience and I'm biased. I'm curious to hear from others, how that is actually working, and I think Vito has his hand up.
Yep. Vito, go ahead. You need to unmute yourself.
Vito is still muted. Vito, are you still there? He had internet connection problems before. I'm wondering if something froze on him. Anybody else on that topic? Michael, what's your experience? I mean, you're primarily modeling the Arctic system, but you are also moving in the larger modeling community.
Yeah, then I chime in for Vito for a second. First of all, I would like to stress that I'm not only modeling, so
yeah, okay,
doing some observations or working with observations. Yeah. But that's a side thing. I was wondering whether on a global scale or in the global discussions, what is the situation with the Southern Ocean observing system elements? Could we join forces with them, maybe with the help of SCAR, to make a case for the observing system polar elements on a global scale? Is that something which has been tried to achieve already from SAON? I don't know. I'm not aware about that.
Probably not through SAON, but we discussed that in the previous session. The Southern Ocean or the Southern Hemisphere situation is different because of the Antarctic Treaty. So and that is driven by the access to territory, and so as part of signing the treaty, nations had to build a station. So they had to have a presence, and that often meant that they built ships to access the stations, either on one of the peninsulas, on the peninsula, or one of these sub Antarctic islands, or stations on the ice. So they are in a different situation. They are much more advanced, I think, than I shouldn't say much more, but I think they are more advanced than the Arctic community with respect to being woven into the global systems.
So I believe Vito dropped off. I did see Eric had his hand up first.
Yeah, Peter, I fully agree with your statement. I think, like you said, that it's very important to have people that have knowledge about working in the Arctic region, and also to be involved in more of the global activities. And I think that is, actually that was one of the reasons why we in Eurogoose formed this Arctic rules. And I think that the idea behind the suggestions for an Arctic goose, I speak for the ocean now only because that should really secure that, because having an Arctic goose involves both observation, but also data management, but more importantly, also the coordination of the activities, because that is an important component of having a system.
Yeah.
That because it has to be composed of different components from different partners and different countries. And it's really important that this is coordinated. So because of the small resources we have, we must not duplicate work. And we have from other parts of the ocean seen examples of people putting their instruments out very close to each other without knowing about each other activity. And that must be avoided to use our funding, limited funding, in the best way possible. So I fully agree with your statement. It's a very good one.
So I see Vito returned. I don't know if he still has a comment or not.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but my computer is quite old and sometimes crash. I try to, because I would like to, I try to find a link and to give an example of an activity that was made in the framework GEO, but GeoNyom for the high mountain regions. The last year they have a meetings, they organize a meeting where they convey a group of experts to try to discuss about the observation in the high mountains region and try to work a little bit about essential variables for high mountain regions. So which are, it's a typical example of what I was imagining then through this organization, Geo, AeroGoose, etc., can come. So they know the system, they know the landscape, so they can mobilize the researcher and try to avoid then the bias coming from individual, what you say, grassroots forces, etc. But at the end, we need to manage the issue of the funding. Eventually, no, of course, sometimes can be the organization, but many times we need to look in general to this process and the funding. We cannot always say we are limited funding, we are not able. We can prepare a plan and at least try to receive the commitment and sufficient resources to develop this in the faster way possible and in the best way possible. Otherwise, we need a limited with what is on place or which we'll be able to do with the resources we have at disposal. But so we can only sustain this activity with a voluntary base, for sure. And yeah, this can be important with the global, but this means only then when you are meeting, you are able to find a good balance of experts and participants.
Yep, thank you.
Jorun had his hand up. Jorun Hardardottir?
Sorry, I'm on now.
There you go.
Sorry. I guess the discussion has evolved a bit since I raised my hand, but I was going to give you some sort of short insight into a success story from like the WMO side of things. There are different HYCOSs around the world, and one is the Arctic HYCOS, which is a hydrometric network in the Arctic. And it's a NMHSs that have sort of like, it's a 8-country steering group, more or less. It's just that we meet once a year, and it's very casual, and more or less what we are trying to do to put together through the limited funding that the NMHSs have, to get together and sort of design observational network that will be sustainable for at least some time, and has sort of like tried to pinpoint the major stations that represent the big basins in the country, in the 8 countries. And then in addition, what we are trying to do on the site is to put together a sort of a hydrological modeling framework at the same time, using those stations and then forecast models. And this has even evolved now within in the last year or so, with Iceland being having the presidential role for the Arctic Council. And what we have been trying to push through with the Icelandic Met Office and all the different, many of the different institutes and the different, more or less, the agencies that working in the Arctic, is that to pushing for the Earth system modeling, so putting together not only the cryospheric and the hydrological and the oceanography and the terrestrial modeling communities, but to put them in the same spot and more or less get out of them, what do you need? And the needs are very varied, and some just need a really good digital elevation model. The met or the climate variables, the hydrological variables are different. And for example, we had a really successful workshop last November here in Iceland, and when people started to discuss things from the different sort of disciplines and to pinpoint what they really needed to do the continuation of the modeling. And there were very interesting things that came up, like some of the oceanography community had been using a static data set from the 1970s of the hydrological input into the Arctic basin, while there we sat 8 people from around the world with the new data sets that are being published both in the TRDC database in Kopelensk and us trying to put on the WMO website. And I'm like, we can provide you data. We can provide new data. And sort of, and this is something that also is very interesting to get those people from the different countries together. But the Arctic Hikers is, on the global perspective, WMO is leading the path more or less. So it's interesting in that sense. It's of all the other hikers that WMO is producing or supporting, this is the most far advanced hikers. But I guess most of it has to deal with that, like we have the money that the other hikers don't.
And that's a great point that you make with respect to what is needed to define the essential variables. I mean, a lot is being determined by empirics, or some by pattern recognition and sort of thinning out data sets to see when are we losing which patterns spatially and temporally. Some is done by specific modeling for observing system design, still somewhat bumpy, but there are some of these things. But then, of course, there is the modeling community that you know, can give valuable input into what they feel would improve their models the most effectively if they would have certain variables. So that's a good point. And for the Arctic, where we have a system, an observing system that crosses all the domains, of course, that observing system of that nature are the best suited to inform Earth system models, whereas, you know, other observing systems are more suited to inform models of a specific domain. So that's a good point.
So Heikki Lievainen had a hand up.
Yeah, just want to mention that when Vito brought up the funding or the resources, at least for the, I would imagine for the road process, most of you know that there is this Horizon 2020 call that is actually implementing of GEOS in the Arctic. So EU funded, and I would assume that there would be some resources to ROS work from applications that has been submitted to this call. There were, I believe, 3 major consortium that submitted proposals, and someone of them will win the competition. But anyway, there are at least some work from the European Union side towards this.
Are there questions in the chat or just comments?
Just a couple comments. Sandy had one. I don't know if she wants to speak up or if everyone can see that. And then Vito provided a link to the GeoGNOME workshop.
Okay, while everybody is reading that, maybe we can sort of take our discussion a step further, and we might come back to the topic that we just discussed. And the step further would be, would just going to the last bullet here, how would members of this group see themselves playing a role in the roads process, and here specifically in this, engagement in activities that would help to identify and define the essential Arctic variables? And can members of that group envision that the working group would convene beyond this specific summit now and continue working on ways to think through how we can better synchronize with the global observing systems, how we can gain synergies, what we might have to do to actually accomplish that?
While people are thinking about that, I see Vito added another question. What about the NSF initiative and proposal? Perhaps he's speaking of the Navigating the New Arctic call for proposals.
Yeah, no, I said about there was a proposal that was presented to drive, from the group IOACN as I believe one of the leads. And Sandy can speak. In fact, the question was for them, for her.
Yeah, so HIO presented to the SAON board a white paper in Archangelsk last year, and then has subsequently updated us a few times about a proposal submitted to the National Science Foundation for a research networking activity that's not quite on the same scale as the Horizon 2020 Arctic GEOS opportunity, but it's still a significant proposal, and it's just in the final throes of the review process, and so we don't have a definitive word on it. But it is through that proposal that it was, what they basically proposed was to pilot the roads process through a food security lens for the Alaska region. And it's got a marine and cryosphere focus. And what you see reflected in the activities of Working Group 1 and Working Group 3 and Working Group 4, the data working group, are all sort of engaged in that process. So we should hear really any day now about the fate of that award and how it might support roads moving forward.
So if I can add a comment, we can say then we are concrete to start now from zero in the sense to have some resources to drive and support the process at the end, both from the European side and US side. So this is should motivate us.
I think that's a positive thing. I mean, of course, you also have Intaros from the European side. You have potential follow-ons, but a lot of that is still design work. And I don't, just to be clear, I don't want to minimize that, but we also have to think about how to accelerate implementation, because that is, of course, something that is behind all of this work. I think, Carl, do you know who was next here? I see Michael has his hand up, but I don't know who is in the chat.
Yeah, Michael is next.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
You're muted.
I'm sorry. Heike has been mentioning the EU call that is out, and the 3 consortia, and I'm chairing one of it, and I see a number of our partners are participating in this discussion. I also see members of competing consortia in the discussion, so I'm pretty sure that people from this group in one way or the other will continue being involved in these discussions, and of course the possibilities are much higher for those or that consortium which in the end will win. But this is a process which will last until, I guess, November or maybe autumn, until we know which of the 3 consortia in the end will win. It's a 2-stage process, and we just submitted the stage 1 proposals in February. So it's a little bit down the road. But in any case, I think there's a high potential that there's a good collaboration between those projects which are going finally to be funded on the US side and the European side, and that's really necessary, and that will also bring some money to the game. And I think not only in terms of coordination, Peter, but also at least in the European call, there's also a large implementation aspect of the call which needs to be dealt with by the proposal, which will win.
I mean that's great news because as was the case with the competition that in the end funded in Taurus, it appears as if there are resources that are committed, and it's just a matter of who will win the competition. But in your proposal, Michael, is there any significant attention paid to connectivity with global observing networks, or is it mainly focused on the Arctic?
Well, it's a little bit difficult to speak openly about the proposals because we are still in the competitive phase, unfortunately, Peter. So I'm sorry for that.
No, that's okay. I see the problem. But let's rephrase the question. Let's just look at the German landscape. To which extent? And you have RV focused on polar research. You have GEOMA mainly focused on the lower latitudes. There is some activity out of Hamburg and Rostock, but Rostock mainly coastal. So how well are global and regional observing activities coordinated in that system, and who is doing it if it happens?
Well, I can't speak so much for GEOMAR and the institute in Rostock or in Warnemünde, but I know that for AVI, of course, there's a strong linkage of the activities with the global scale. I mean, if you think about the linkage of the atmospheric activities to the global scale. The modeling in any case, I mean, AVI is also running Earth system models, and even with the activities which were focused on the Arctic, like in the AOMIP and FAMOUS program, there were not only regional models and data acquisition involved, but also the global aspect with global models also participating. So there's a pretty good interaction, I would say. But of course, it's a very different thing if you think about a coordinated observing system setup.
Yeah.
And that is clearly something which is where the good coordination seems to be missing between the global initiatives and the Arctic initiatives. And I think one thing I wanted to say earlier is whether the Arctic observing system could learn from other regional observing system elements and their interaction with the global system. I'm not very familiar with those other regional systems on the globe, but I would guess that there is something like tropical observing system elements. Maybe there's something to learn from their kind of interaction.
Yeah, great, thanks. On the comments, I saw that Vito was positive on participating in a process that would help establish the EAVs in the context of global observing system as part of the ROADS process. There were one thing I should just mention at that point. I tried to follow both the conversation, look at the virtual hands, and I tried to keep track of the chat. But at some point, you know, there are my capacity to take up all these 3 channels is limited. So if you want to make a statement for everybody that's important to you, it might be good, because we are a small enough group to just raise your virtual hand and get it out that way.
So in that light, Vito, did you want to say anything more about your most recent comment, most recent chat?
I say then just to make an example at the European level, the approach to have a regional network and cover the European area for in situ measurements are addressed by this regional research infrastructure. Maybe many of you know about ICOS, then refer to greenhouse gases, or we can have ACTRIS and address aerosols, but there are several. And 5 years ago, the Commission, there is this process to develop research infrastructure at the European level, and was a process, and the European Commission started a process to create clusters of this infrastructure for the different areas, from medicine, engineering, physics, and so for the environmental area was created this community, ENVRI community. So I provide a couple of links that can give you the idea of how this community is developing. SIOS is strongly involved in this community and provide in some way the Arctic sector, cover the Arctic area, and also I know that there are a strong pushing from the Commission to move this more in the coordination, this cluster in the coordination of the activities. So this is the line in Europe. So if you like to know about how the networks are developing at the European level, these links can provide all information. I believe Eki can support and also add more, because it's actively part of the coordination body of this community.
Thanks, Vito.
So Eric had his hand up.
Yeah, speaking on behalf of Eurogoose and Copernicus, I can say that there certainly is an interest to be involved in the further process of defining the Arctic observing system. For Copernicus, it's not only ocean, but Eurogoose is only ocean. But for Copernicus, it's more than the ocean. It's also atmospheric composition, cryosphere, and so on. So then you can claim Copernicus is not a global program, but it's a European program at least.
I think both of these, lines of information or contribution, both ways to contribute, I think would be great to have. While you're thinking about how you might want to engage, or what you think about whether or not this group should continue to convene after the summit, there is also a question that addresses to what extent can the roads process engage with and make use of existing technical structures for reviewing, defining, assessing essential Arctic variables? And one example is the OSCAR R3 process that is listed here. Or question is also posed, what about the Copernicus process? So those of you who are running or are, have a large responsibility for one of the Arctic, more the Arctic centric observing systems, have you already actually engaged along these lines? And are you using some of the procedures that have been established by some of these more global observing systems to figure out how to identify, define, describe, and normalize these variables in terms of the measurement procedures and the standards, the data reporting? Or did you come up with your own procedures based on what you think is the most useful for the domain that you're observing?
I see Eric has a hand up.
Yeah, again, speaking on behalf of Copernicus, I mean, the work that we have done in setting up this database for requirements is very much inspired by the OSCAR system. So if you saw my presentation and the WMO presentation earlier today, you could see the systems are very much alike. And in the Copernicus system now, we are very much in the process of discussing requirements, because we have the variables clear mind of what variables is needed, but we really need to have a discussion on for instance, spatial and timely resolution. Timeliness of data is more or less clear because we are more or less an operational system, so there's a need for real-time data. But we also have activities, especially the climate service, where delayed mode data is an issue, but how much delayed they can be is for discussion. So there's a lot of discussions on these issues going on, and it would be very helpful for us in that process to have the opinions of other people engaged in the roads process. So I think we can help each other in that respect.
That's great, thanks.
And Molly had her hand up.
Yeah, I was trying to see how the Alaska Ocean Observing System and the IOOS program fits in this, because Alaska is the only Arctic piece of the IOOS program. So we are always advocating for to include the Alaska and the Arctic in all of the various national activities. A lot of my colleagues are leaders in the global programs such as the Global Ocean Acidification Network, the Global Harmful Algal Bloom Network. And so they are also looking to see how the IOOS regions fit within these global networks. And we AOS kind of follows along with those. I think our biggest way of connecting with the global networks is making sure that our data collection is done according to the standards, the international standards, that we have metadata that follows international standards, that our data system is interoperable with other entities, that our data is archived and accessible. So I'm still struggling a little bit to figure out how we play in the long run. And I had sent Sandy a little private chat about US AON and the role that US AON plays in the US and in these global networks. and if it was broad enough perspective from the operational and the research agencies to kind of encompass a broader piece. So I guess I'm just rambling here, trying to think about this.
Yeah, but while you were rambling in your own words, you actually delivered some important information, because if I understood you correctly, you are saying that, you know, some of the standards, some of the quality of the data, etc., is sort of synchronized with what the other pieces of the IUs are doing. So it's not developed based on, you know, your own activities, but there is some synergy that's being gained by taking on the standards that are developed in the network as a whole.
Oh, definitely. And we have a much larger focus now on biodiversity data and data standards and access to those data. So yes, we benefit by that national system a lot. And a lot of the national systems in various places are more connected directly to some of the global networks, but it all trickles down to all of the, to us. In particular, in terms of how we collect data and how we, the kinds of metadata and how we access it, how we archive it, etc.
So in a way, you are connected to a global.
We are, I think so. Yes.
To various channels, and as you said before, you know, quite a few of the people in the network are also connected with the global community, which is important.
So Helen had a chat comment saying, in thinking of the last question, I assume that's the last bullet point, regarding continuation of this group in current process. I was wondering whether there might be any organization or body that might be missing so far in the roads process and should be asked to join so as to be inclusive.
Yeah, it's Helen here. I'm not sure that I have an answer to that. I was just sort of thinking about, it was the last bullet. Yeah, that was the question I was thinking about. And I think you may have some of the elements in this working group as a body that could be maybe moving forward. But what sort of struck me in the discussion is, you know, maybe, I don't know, you know, the social sciences, the sort of human health side of things. So I was just wondering if, and others are more expert than I am, as to whether there's others that should be involved if this group is going to be moving forward. That was it.
That's a great point, Helen. I think the group would have to be rounded out. But Sandy, to which extent do you think that the roads process actually has engaged the kind of entities that you think have to be engaged?
So that's a good question. I would say that we have kind of hit just the highest level of key partners so far. We have reached out to, for example, some of the Arctic Council working groups, but not all. We've talked quite a bit with AMAP and quite a bit actually with CAF and CBMP. But for example, the Sustainable Development Working Group or PAIM or EPPR, we have not reached out to yet, but they're sort of on our radar screen. The same could be said for some of the global initiatives. We've had some conversations, you know, a healthy number of conversations with WMO, and through various avenues have had some of those conversations with Goose, and we actually sit in on the Goose Regional Alliance to kind of further that dialogue. And then, you know, really just through the concept development process, the review process, and conversations in between, we've had pretty ad hoc engagement, you know, with Interact, for example, or ISOA, or DBO. So I think that, you know, I think it's the AOS is a step change in terms of how much kind of understanding there is that SAN's moving in this direction, but we have not really done anything by way of a organized strategic engagement strategy, and in fact that's part of why we tapped this group to get us thinking more constructively about that. And I think that the starting point matrix is actually, you know, it's looking like a pretty good start. On the social science piece, I wanted to mention that on our board from Sweden is, I'm gonna forget her name right when I need it. I remembered it yesterday. Jan maybe can help me out in the chat. She was gonna be going to the ICAS meeting, the social science meeting in Arkhangelsk. She's herself a social scientist, and has helped us to recognize some of the places, like with the Arctic Social Indicators Group, that we could maybe engage and get more involved. But I would say certainly right now, the kind of health communities are not really on our radar screen at all. And that would be an important group to get focused on.
Yeah, in a way, actually, what was it called? ArcticNet had quite a bit of emphasis on, you know, health delivery. I think the Amazon sort of went through communities and did deliver some health support. But now, clearly, with the coronavirus shock that has hit, you know, the world globally, there is more attention drawn to the fact that some of the local communities are really very vulnerable, and that many of them are probably not at all prepared, as is the world as a whole. So looking at that, I think is a good direction. But social sciences in general, and that's where we probably have a bit an issue with the connection to the global programs. There are not that many programs that would look at that part globally. Most of the global observing systems are actually more narrowly defined around a sphere or part of a sphere than the Arctic observing system that really goes across all the sectors. So that's something to think about. Let me go back to that question again about whether or not that group would, as part of the AOS process, not just the AOS meeting, the summit meeting, if the group would be, or let me rephrase that, would you think that it would be useful to have a group like this continue to work between the summits if it is rounded out correctly? I mean, some of you already have said that you would be happy to contribute, but there were just a few voices. There was quite a bit of silence. Would those of you who, you know, might not want to participate personally for whatever reason, would you think it's a useful exercise to keep that group going between the observing summits to figure out how these connections with the global observing systems and the lower latitude programs can be made more effective, and how they can be steered into a way where synergies are gained?
It looks like Michael Karcher had a comment about the EU Kepler project. Michael, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, but that would not be a direct response to Peter. I typed it in before he asked his latest question. But maybe in direct response to Peter, I think it certainly would make sense to continue this group, but it would be very important to have a very clear task for this group to discuss, so that it's not interfering
with the ongoing discussion of other groups in the context of SEON, so that there is no, loss of time by people discussing about things which are at the same time discussed by others, and people step on each other's feet. So if there's a clear task structure for what to discuss by which group, it certainly makes sense to continue this between the AOSs.
Thanks, Michael.
Helen says, yes, I would support a group like this continuing, as I see a role for the group, perhaps with the rounding out, as you call it. And then Molly says, I agree with Helen, but agree it should have a clear charge. And Heike says, agree with Michael, and also coordination between working groups. So it sounds like there's some agreement there.
Thank you. Michael, you had another question that you...
Yeah, it was not a question, but rather an answer, or one possible answer to your last question. Who could be involved, or who in addition could be involved? The European Kepler program is a 2-year program dealing with improving the usability and of the operational iServices and the Copernicus services in Europe, which contains a lot of people who may give good input to the roads process. So looking into that group is certainly meaningful.
So while we are continuing to go through these questions, it also, I think we have reached a point where it would be great to see what kind of recommendations you would want to see put forward as part of the conference statement. Because the process of formulating the main items that go into the conference statement, and of course the recommendations are a big part of that. The recommendations are sort of formulated in a way that they can inform the Arctic Science Ministerial. So, what is on your mind in terms of recommendations that you would like to see as part of such a statement? And I know many of you have seen previous statements. You know that there is a short sort of positioning that then leads into recommendations. The total document is typically about 2 pages, where 1 page is sort of the positioning. In this case, probably starting with the present Corona crisis, but then going into, showing that this shows how vulnerable the world as a whole is, going over quickly to pointing out that the Arctic is a hotspot, and that it actually is affected heavily in many ways, including the observing activities. And then after this positioning, it goes into the recommendations. So which recommendations can you imagine, or would you like to see?
Maybe I raise the hand. I don't know, Vito speaking. I don't know if I'm the first. I see also Colin with the hands. But okay, since my English is not very fantastic, just I trade the points. I believe then for sure to indicate our how we consider roads a very good process, and the metrics. Eventually talk about the metrics. We was discussing today about the metrics that we like to use for roads. So this can be a point, and the connection. Apparently we have this good agreement, and for sure is a very important element is to connect as much as possible, more and as much as possible, the Arctic with the global observing system, and try to capture the best practice, but also so to share also the specific elements, but also take the best practice and try to, in this way, to build from what is on place, extending, because and the other point, then we need not only to connect but also to dialogue, because for sure there is a need to extend observing system. I believe this can be some key element. Then could be nice to be in the recommendation. We was talking a lot about that, but okay, the other point, funding. Then we can, this good process need, we are looking for our pockets, but external pocket will be also necessary.
Okay, yeah, funding did come up in another group where we said there is probably quite a bit of, there are quite a few resources made available in terms of what you could call rescue packages. And the question is, which part which case can we make for enhancing gathering data in the Arctic system while this crisis is playing out, that would help us then to get better prepared, or actually us, meaning the communities in the north, get better prepared and more resilient for the future. So that, you know, there are a lot of data, if not captured right now, they might be a big loss in terms of our ability to design structures for increased resiliency. I did see Helen's comment on, you know, a comment that I made, a remark that I made at the beginning of the session, which is sort of enhancing the extension of global observing systems into the Arctic. I think that if people feel that this is a valuable one, we could add that. And then we have Colin, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, so I try to speak quietly so I don't wake up the house. But it was a point that was brought up earlier, but also in another session, about lifting Arctic observation networks out of research budgets. And Eric had a slide on it and some information on it from the European side, at least. It sounds like, I don't know if it was Sandy or if it was Molly who was talking about it earlier, that there was a top-down initiative in the US where they essentially were told that they could get funding to support an observation network. And that kind of thing, in many countries, at least in the EU side, doesn't happen, and certainly not in the Kingdom of Denmark. So the sustained observation programs that we have, for the most part, are actually funded out of research funds, and is kind of dangerous for the sustained nature. So I think some kind of comment or some kind of commitment from Arctic Council countries to sustain those observation programs and lifting them out of research budgets would be good to highlight.
I see Michael had a hand up.
Yeah, I can start with strongly supporting what Colin has just been mentioning. The funding issue, the long-term funding issue is a key thing, and that may be linked to the question that Peter has been raising before about the integration with the global observing systems. I think the better we can make the case for integrating an Arctic observing system into global systems in the end, the easier it will be to convince governments to fund also the Arctic extension or the Arctic part of it. The other thing is, I think it's really important that an observing system is user-driven, which means that it's driven by the needs of the people living in the Arctic, the indigenous people, the local population, and the actors in the Arctic. Decision makers and people living there, and commercial people. Then one other aspect, I think, is the necessity for an international coordination and integration of observations, and that means research-based observations as well as monitoring focused observations on an international level. That means circumpolar, pan-Arctic. And then, yeah, that's the main thing, I think. Yeah, that's it.
Eric was next, right? And then comments.
Yes, Eric had a hand up, and there were several new comments in the chat window for people who are following along.
Yeah.
So Eric?
I just want to, first of all, I of course agree with the long-term funding and the user-driven. That's very good points. The comment I actually wanted to make was the thing on enhancing the extension to global systems. We discussed that also a bit early in the previous session.
Yep.
I suggested to have a paragraph linked to that we endorse the idea forwarded on the establishment of an Arctic goose.
Mm-hmm. Yep, thanks.
Sandy, you put in a couple comments in the chat. Did you want to explain those, or should I read those?
I could come off mute for them. So I'll start with the second one. At Working Group 4 yesterday, when we were talking about the SAON societal benefit framework, there was a recommendation from Pierre Luigi, I'm going to forget his last name, that we crosswalk the SAON Arctic specific societal benefits with the UN Sustainable Development goals. And one of the benefits of doing that is that they have done a lot of automatic mapping between the Sustainable Development Goals and different phenomena and essential variables. And so he said that it would potentially provide, if we did that crosswalk, it could provide a shortcut to us identifying areas of common interest with the global networks. And so that's, you know, a bit too rudimentary of a recommendation for the conference statement, but I think it does, you know, even in a simple sentence, you could talk about the value of not just trying to link our observing networks, but trying to link our objectives for observing that are reflected in our societal benefit frameworks. And the other point was that the global programs, as in like the case of the WMO example I gave, they're used to serving as conveners, and they often have capacity to bring coordinators into efforts that are deemed valuable to them. And that is a potential way that we could call on them to help contribute to the process as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Vito entered another comment in the chat window. Vito, would you like to speak to that?
For sure, we need to stress the relevance of the connection with the data, because and so there are some forum, the Polar Data Forum, the Antarctica, and there is the Research Data Alliance. For sure, this the data is a key issue when we like to connect Arctic with the global system, and so we have actors and organizational forum where the community, the data community, convey and discuss together the strategy to work more homogeneously in this sense. So I believe then one point with respect to the fact, and it's very important, the data issue is very important in any strategy, then try to integrate is a good point in the recommendation, and eventually we can link to this initiative. There are global initiatives, the Research Data Alliance or the Polar Initiative, the Polar Data Forum, then for sure is involved now in Work Group 4. So it's a way to express the Work Group 4, but just moving a little bit outside the AOS scheme.
Thanks. And as we are thinking more about that, we should probably also put that our thoughts about recommendations into the context of the theme of this Arctic Observing Summit. As you know, each Arctic Observing Summit has its own theme. This one is observing for action. So is there looking through that lens, is there something that comes to mind where you feel, we are lacking either in fundamental design, so that we are not capable of delivering the observations that could be used for designing actions or options for actions, or are we too slow?
The near real-time issue. The near real-time issue is also very important. The timing. Mainly, if you like to be operational, you need to improve the delivery of the data.
Helen made a comment in the chat about would we want to make a reference to the United Nations initiative on Decade on Ocean Science for Sustainable Development? Could reinforce the role of observations in the Arctic to attain global and also Arctic SDGs.
It's Helen here. I'm not really all that familiar as to what the format of this document would look like. I was just sort of wondering about something sort of happening fairly important globally, and we might be able to make a reference to it, and how sort of ocean observations would be able to contribute to this sustainable development goals that they have, if it would fit somewhere in there.
Yeah, I think we probably will use the present coronavirus crisis to relate to something that everybody actually pays attention to for good reasons. How to get to the SDGs, we probably have to see how that that bridge can be built. So yeah, we will look at that. Carl, did you see the sequence here? We have 3 hands up.
Yes, Eric was first, then Colin, then Michael.
I have a comment on this observing for action and the data availability. I think it's very important that we try to put focus also on unlocking existing data, because as we have stated several times, much of the observations done in the Arctic is done via short-term research projects. And we experience that it's often data from these projects are delivered in very delayed mode for various reasons, publications and so on. But we have also in the Antares project got the information that scientists in principle are open to exchange the data, but they don't have the resources or the knowledge to do that. And their home organization don't have a proper data management system. So there's an issue of unlocking data and help data exchange in that respect.
Yeah, that's a good point. There are probably a lot of stranded data sets around that actually have high quality, but as you pointed out, for various reasons, did not make it into the public domain.
Colin was next.
Okay, I just wanted to expand on the part Helen mentioned with respect to the Decade of Ocean Science. I think that it also could be some leverage for us. Although it says ocean science, I mean, I think in particular the Arctic for a region is so dependent and interconnected with the ocean that most observations in the Arctic region can come into that kind of under that umbrella, if you like. And I think there could be an opportunity in conjunction with the starting of that to have this agenda. I mean, initiating a coordinated Arctic observation network as part of the goals of the decade. And this was discussed in Tromsø. It should have been the focus of a workshop in Copenhagen, which is going to be postponed to fall. But maybe that's a good opportunity to have a continued discussion of this, as all of the 6 themes of the decade relate very well to all the points that are coming up here.
That's a good thought, Colin. And while Michael is getting ready, as we are thinking further let's add one more dimension, and that is what should SEON do in terms of a better fit into the global/region landscape. So the question is there anything in terms of recommendations that would relate to SEON, probably through the roads process? I think some of that already came up, but just want to bring that back in to see if there is a specific recommendation along these lines. But Michael is up now.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to refer to what you said earlier, Peter, that you certainly will make reference to the COVID-19 crisis currently. I think we can easily draw the line or the parallel to the climate change process, which is happening. Just that the COVID-19 shows very, very drastically and very dramatically how important the international collaboration is, and an exchange of data, an exchange of knowledge, and that we need something. It shows just how important it is, and as a very fast process, it makes it very clear. But we have this similar situation with a longer term process with climate change, which is coming along. And so I think we can draw this line, this parallel, to make clear how important it is to have a good functioning, well integrated, internationally integrated observing system for the Arctic, which is also connected to the global observing scale, so that information exchange can be easy and fluid and useful.
To which extent does do the documents around the Paris Accord and then IPCC SR15, the 1.5 degree report, help us make the case that Arctic observations are essential, are not at the point where they should be, and have to be accelerated?
I don't know actually whether there's any specific reference to the sparsity and lack of observations in the Arctic in those documents, but for sure there is a reference to the quick change of climate in the Arctic as one of the regions with the largest or the fastest development, and that at the same time it's probably our duty as a community to make the point that there is this scarcity of data and where the lacks are, the gaps.
I mean, ideally you would make the case that it's definitely, I think in the 1.5 degree report, they sort of put up a scale of which systems are really pushing the boundaries, and I think coral reefs are the furthest into the red, but I think the Arctic might be number 2, and so using that fact and then make a good case why we need an enhanced observing system to not go faster, deeper into the red. I think that would be the link that would have to be made.
Helen put in a chat comment saying that she agrees with Vito's comments on the need for more real-time observations. These are needed for better services to be delivered in the Arctic region. For example, weather forecasts, search and rescue, and spill response.
Yep, and that's also if we are going into the health area. You know, if you're looking at what is playing out right now, a lot of the observing and a lot of the data streams that we have to produce to understand what is happening, how it's spreading, all that kind of stuff has to be based on near real-time data.
I don't see any other comments or hands raised at the moment.
Okay, so I think we are through many of the questions here. We got quite a bit of input on recommendations. At this point, I just would like to ask the question, do you see any topic that you feel should be addressed by this working group, but has not been captured in the questions that were posed to you either in the previous session or in this session? In other words, do you feel that we are missing something important in our discussion that is relevant for the relationship between an Arctic observing system and global observing systems?
Molly put in a comment that may be relevant. She says that lack of communications in the Arctic is a major gap. I'm not sure what type of communications she's referring to.
Yeah, I can just, it's just the communications, just being able to relay, whether it's telemetry or internet or whatever, it's just a huge gap in the Arctic. So it makes it very difficult, even if you had the ability to do real-time data collection, it's still a gap in trying to transmit it in real time or near real time.
Michael?
Michael had his hand up.
Yeah, when it comes to what may be missing when it comes to the interaction with the global community, I think it would be really helpful if we can identify persons in those international organizations which are open to discuss about the better linkage or the interaction with those global systems. Because it's always the personal level of activity and engagement which is necessary to bring things forward. So if SEON can identify contact persons in each of those which agree to be involved into this process, that would be great.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Mike. And then I see that happening on two levels. One is on the organization level, and the other one is on the scientist level, right? Because you probably need both.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Helen had a comment in the chat.
Yeah, it's
Helen,
Helen here. Yeah, I can do that. Thanks. Sorry, I'm thinking slower later in the day it gets here. But on that climate change discussion, I'm not all that familiar with the IPCC special report on ocean and cryosphere that came out, was it just last fall, December-ish?
Yeah.
But there might be some comments or recommendations coming out of that might be useful to draw on at some point, whether it's in this document that we're putting ideas for, but they no doubt would have some reference to the need for Arctic observations, the gap in them or something like that, I thought.
Yeah, it's a good point to look back at that. I mean, I remember that, quite a bit of attention, of course, was sea level and things like that, shrinking albedo, but one would have to look back at it in more detail to see if there is something that is directly usable. There was also a report on the climate system and food security, a special report, IPCC, that was whatever, maybe a year or so ago. So any other things that you feel we missed in our discussion of that topic that this working group was charged with?
Sandy asked the question, excuse me, did SWEPA do a gaps analysis?
Whoa.
It does, but probably more on the conceptual level than at the specific level that we are asking for. There are always, you could say, general statements about lack of observations in many of the areas, but yeah, so it's worthwhile taking a look at that, but I think what is written there is also covered somewhere else.
Yeah, and if you're looking at a possible continuation of the work of this working group, you could actually imagine to use the compilation of activities and the programs and the variables that are measured in them, and who's driving them, to derive something like a gap analysis.
I don't see any further comments or hands raised.
And we don't really have to use the entire 2.5 hours. So if people feel that they could say everything they wanted to say, that they feel that we have addressed the questions, that they feel that the recommendations or the suggestions for recommendations that we came up with are comprehensive, reflecting our discussion, we also could conclude the session.
Molly had a hand up.
Yep, Molly.
I'm going back and forth between mute and unmute. I guess I'm, Peter, do you plan to, I mean, I think we've had a lot of suggestions and discussion here, but I'm not sure I know what our key recommendations are. What is your plan for like distilling this into a few key recommendations that then you would circulate to us to look at and provide some comments, or what's your proposed plan of action? Or is that the next session that does that?
No, I think the next session is too late. So we have to get something out before that, because the next session is, I'm just looking at my time zone, so you have to translate that from...
Well, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, my time zone, I know.
Yes, 4 o'clock in the morning, my time zone. I think at that point, we have to have some sort of draft of the report of this. So there are two things that we have to produce. One is a summary of the deliberations of Working Group 5, and that should fit onto 2 slides, 2 transparencies that would be presented in the concluding session tomorrow morning or afternoon, whichever time zone you are in the last 2-hour block. And then we also have to work on a document that the combination of the steering group for this summit plus the leads of the working groups are putting together, that is in essence the first draft of the conference statement and the recommendations. So between Jan, René, Torsten and myself, we have to use the material that we have collected and distill the material for these 2 documents. That will be available because we do have before that session, when we have another session. So things can be refined, but as you would expect, I mean, I wouldn't expect that they would be completely different. That would be somewhat of an issue then. But what we come up with in that final session as review of what we have done, refinement thereof, can still filter into the presentation during the working group outcome during the last block. To which extent it still can go into, and it probably still can go into the recommendations of the conference statement, but that becomes a little bit more difficult because there are many working groups working on it. There are many people sort of fine-tuning it. So I think we have, Jan René, we have 1 hour after the end of this session, right, to give input into the rough draft of the conference statement and recommendations, and then a small writing group will take that over and will prepare it for discussion during the final block. For the working group, we still can refine what we will summarize now during the last session tomorrow morning.
And in addition to what will happen on the last day, there will also be a report coming out of this, and we'll be asked for contribution to that. And maybe we can focus on that tomorrow, what will be the statement that we want to put into that report. But it should also be mentioned that the summit statement will be presented at an overall level tomorrow, but there will be a week after that where everyone can go and provide their comments. So the version that you see tomorrow is not the final one. But as Peter said, we have to deliver something, yeah, within the next hour or 1.5 hours.
Because the Icelandic minister who will give remarks during the concluding session would like to see some input that is a combination of what all the working groups have been talked so far. So this is always the art during these meetings, to let the discussion go until the very end and give people a chance to have input up to the last point. But at the same time, you have to prepare something that's presented, and especially in this format with the remote links, it's a little bit more tricky, I have to say, than when we did that in person, because we could actually sit. Sometimes we were actually doing that, sitting till past midnight and then sort of putting the last bits and pieces together, and then it went straight into the session in the morning. Here we have different time zones, and so it's a little bit more tricky. We have to produce it somewhat earlier in the process.
So does that mean, Peter, that the next session, which was scheduled for 11 a.m. Iceland time, is not happening?
It will happen.
It will.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And
so
that's
but the recommendations will be done in advance. I'm just wondering whether I need to get up at 3 in the morning.
That's when you will see what has been distilled, and
okay.
That's your chance to refine it and to say, this
okay.
is really not good.
when it comes to, but again, when it comes to the final statement, there will be a version tomorrow, but you will have another week to provide your input and refine it. So I don't see what is happening tomorrow. That's not kind of the final word that each of you can have on the outcome of the summit.
But Jan René, don't motivate Molly not to get up.
3 o'clock in the morning. That's right.
I was up at midnight, and then I had a session at 2 o'clock and one at 5 o'clock, and since then I'm on non-stop.
I know, this is crazy.
This is
I mean,
I appreciate
it's
everything.
It's 1:30 in the night here, so we know the business.
Yeah, I know. It's a day and night sort of. Everything is blurred. If I look at my calendar, there's no distinction anymore. and then you're trying to figure out where are the few hours of sleep here and there that you need to keep going. That's a downside of all these virtual links, because people just schedule that stuff. I think we will learn on that front too, how to sort of be a little bit less enthusiastic about being able to do every meeting virtually, because you don't have to travel there. You just get in front of the computer.
Yeah. It's Helen here. Yeah. Thanks, Carl. I just wanted to respond to your question when you had asked us, was there anything that we felt we wanted to raise that we hadn't raised? I think the more important question is to both of you, going, do you have what you think you need to be able to write something, or is there something else that you would like to have come from us to help you do what you need to do?
I think we have the major points. Jan René, what do you think?
I agree.
So there was still chat comments. Carl, do you follow what's on there?
No, there's no more chat comments that I see, and no raised hands at the moment either.
I think Vito suggests that we end early this session, if I interpret him correctly. Okay.
A win-win situation for us and for you.
Okay, yeah.
You need to work, and we can go to sleep a little bit earlier. So we say win-win is a good.
Okay, with this, that's a good closing statement. So would like to thank everybody for hanging in there, and would be great to see many of you for the last session, but we do understand that time zones are tricky, and you will see all that stuff during the, if you join us for the last session, you will see it there. You will get it if you attend the concluding session. You will see our conclusions there. And then you will have a chance to comment on everything that we did. And as Jan-René said, beyond the conference statement, there will be a detailed report. And that's where a lot of the material actually can go in that will not make it into the very short conference statement / recommendation document of just 2 pages. Okay.
Yeah, so also from my side, many thanks, Peter and Jan, René and others for organizing this tremendous effort, really. And it was fun and very productive. Can you just give us an advice? Should we participate still in the last session, in the 11 o'clock session, Iceland time?
The last session of Working Group 5 or
the session 4, findings and recommendations. Is that still something where you expect an input from us? Or is it the wrap up you do yourself?
What I believe would happen is that we're a small group now. I believe that other people will be around tomorrow. So the discussion could be a bit different, but I think we have captured the main points in what we have in front of us here now. So I'll leave it to you, noting that I think the main points have been captured here.
Okay.
Yeah, the session will take place. So Jan, René and I will be there.
Yeah,
depending on how many people join us, we will sort of adjust on the spot, you know, where the discussion should go. But you know, we do realize that it is a tough schedule. I think with that, let me thank everybody for sticking with that. And I know many of you have participated in all 3 sessions so far. So that's great. I think we got quite a bit of feedback, and we will do our best to summarize that. And then you will have a chance to come back in and make sure that your thoughts are reflected in the summaries. With that, good evening, good night. I'm not sure if we have somebody. Almost good morning, right? I think we passed midnight in some time zones.
The night is long enough.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Time for you, the evening. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye. Thank you.
thank you. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
So this is Carl. I just wanted to be sure somebody online was going to stop the recording.
I can do that.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, okay. Maybe it hasn't recorded. Because, yeah, that's interesting. Won't it?
Yeah, I can stop the recording if you want. I'm the moderator. Are you guys okay for me to stop it?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you and good night.
Yeah, good night.